My name is Ross, and we're all here with the Progressive Labor Party, and we're trying to figure out and understand what's going on with this economic crisis and just economics in general, but mainly focused on the crisis.
My name is Luis, and we're joined by Rod, who's going to be our, Ross, first of all, our moderator. Me just kind of hang on, and Rod, who's going to be, I guess, the interviewee. So, Rod, do you want to give a little bit of a...
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to be here to help discuss these questions about the current crisis. As we know, capitalism is just filled with crises all the time, and the current one is particularly severe. I've been a professor of economics for about 40 years, and I've often found that the Marxist approach to understanding the economy is the best way to go. So we're going to be talking a little bit today about the current crisis and where it came from and where it's going.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic.
So the first question is, we are currently going through a very serious economic crisis. What are the causes and factors that shape this crisis?
Well, I think the first thing we want to note is how severe the current crisis is. There are at least 20 million people officially unemployed. It's probably double that. And certainly the unemployment among African Americans is at least twice whatever the white unemployment rate is, sometimes 3 times. And we know that the severity of the unemployment has hit the African American population especially hard. It's part of the racist structure of the economy. So I think that's the first thing we want to note. And then, of course, on top of the massive unemployment is the move towards bankruptcies among many companies. And the other thing I want to just make sure we don't forget is that this is a worldwide crisis. That there's massive unemployment in many countries throughout the world. And the proximal cause, the initial cause of it, is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. So we know that pandemic is the reason that the governments around the world have closed down their economies in order to have people isolate themselves from each other in order to stop the spread of COVID-19. Now, a lot of the political leaders have made the absurd argument that there's going to be a real snapback once the pandemic is under control and then once we have a vaccine and so on. But the reality is there's a much bigger crisis looming underneath this one that's caused by the pandemic.
So you mentioned one thing specifically. I think it's important to note that there's growing unemployment, but there are also people that kind of have the ability to work from home and some people that don't. That seems to be something that has a class kind of character. There seems to be a class character to that type of dichotomy. Could you maybe go a little bit in detail as to how and why this is happening?
Sure. Well, I think the people who work in offices and in government service and so on, in many cases are white collar workers who are in positions to function remotely and therefore are less exposed to COVID-19. I think that it's a matter of the stratification that's happened within the working class that has led the tremendous impact on Latino and African American workers, because these are the workers who disproportionately are in the frontline jobs where they can't work from home. In other words, you can't drive a bus from home if you're a bus driver. And so the bus drivers are exposed to a lot more COVID-19. In fact, in the DC area, there's been at least 20 or 30 of the drivers who have come down with the COVID-19. So I think that's an example of the differential impact of this. Now, of course, for the people who are like in the ruling class, the big capitalists, they don't care. They're sitting up pretty wherever they are, and they don't have to go out at all. They've got servants coming to them. So, I think that there is a class dimension to it, but there's also a stratification within the working class that has led to a differential impact.
Why is unemployment data always so poor? Because, we'll constantly be hearing about why, things are really great, but in reality, everybody's, underemployed, or or like the data that they use to measure unemployment is always very shoddy. You know what I mean?
Well, sure. The unemployment rate, there's several different unemployment rates. The one that's usually reported in the press is called U3, and that only accounts for a percentage of the total unemployment. U6 is a better measure, and that includes a lot more people who are working part-time but would like to be working full-time. It includes people who are discouraged from looking for a job because they've tried for months and months and haven't been able to find anything, and so they stop looking, and now then they're no longer considered unemployed. So U6 does include those people in the unemployment rate. But the reality is that these rates are not censuses. You know, they're estimates that are based on surveys that are done periodically. So there's always going to be a lot of error in the unemployment rates. And I think that it's only a kind of a rough idea of the distress in the economy. But of course, when it goes way up like it is, getting close to 20%, officially it's like around 14%, but it's probably, even with all the errors, the new errors that they've introduced, it's probably more like 20%. And then added on to that, it's probably more like 35 or 40% for African Americans. So that's the kind of situation we're facing, where unemployment, the rate that's given is not adequate, but at least it does give us an idea of the severity of the crisis.
So one thing I hear a lot about is like that there's like a 17% of American companies are considered zombie companies. What's a zombie company?
Sure. Well, you know, one of the things that happened, if we go back to the crisis of 2008, the Great Recession, there was an enormous expansion of the money supply and low interest rates created by the Federal Reserve Board. And as a result, many companies which were sort of marginal companies, barely making any profit, you know, there's a certain distribution. A lot of companies aren't doing too well, others do well. And so they tried to stay afloat by borrowing money at these very low interest rates. Now, what people have called the zombie companies used to be a small percentage of the companies, and that meant that they were only surviving by borrowing more money to pay back their existing loans. And so they really weren't getting anywhere, kind of like the Red Queen running faster and faster, but staying in the same place. And, you know, that's from Alice in Wonderland. I don't know if anybody reads that anymore. Anyway, so the problem, though, is now about 1 in 6 companies are zombie companies in the country because of the continuing challenge that companies are facing with profitability. So that means that the debt overhang has gotten very severe. There's probably about $10 trillion of debt in bonds that are out that are in danger. There's been a lot of downgrading of debt to junk bond characteristics by the rating agencies and so on. So we're actually looking at a much more severe recession and a much more severe crisis, because the reality is that the debt has gotten so great among corporations that they are actually threatened with massive bankruptcies. We've already seen some major companies go into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, such as JCPenney's and so on. So I think that the existence of these zombie corporations that you're talking about is another sign that we're facing a much bigger crisis than just one caused by the pandemic.
Of course, every crisis kind of shapes and reshapes the political economy of the U.S. So I think it's important to look at what happened in the prior crisis to understand how we ended up here. So maybe you could go into detail about the responses that were taken to kind of alleviate the 2008 financial crisis and the measures that are taken now to try to alleviate this crisis.
Sure. The 2008 crisis was the biggest one since the Great Depression. It's bigger than all the other recessions we've had since World War II, and really threatened the whole structure of U.S. capitalism, as well as having a global impact. It wasn't just, you know, the U.S. that was in crisis in 2008. So one of the things that the government did was to try to bail out a lot of the major financial corporations. You may remember that Lehman Brothers went under, which was a major blow. And in order to prevent other big financial companies from going under, The Fed extended huge numbers of loans. The Treasury Department extended lots of loans and guarantees. And as a result, they were able to keep the financial sector from going under completely. But it took many, many years for them to recover. And what's happened is, at the time, everybody was saying, well, these very, very low interest rates, the typical interest rate historically has been around 4 to 6% for loans. But they've been keeping the interest rate low at around a 1-2% level ever since the Great Recession. And in addition, they had what they called quantitative easing, which is a fancy word for creating money out of thin air. And they issued hundreds of billions of dollars of new money in '08 to try to help strengthen or get the companies to survive by getting these extra injections of cash from the Federal Reserve Board. Now, the idea was once the economy got back on its feet, more or less, these extraordinary measures that were taken back then would be rolled back. You would start to reduce the amount of quantitative easing. You would start letting the bonds that you'd issued mature and not reissue them. And you would allow the interest rates to rise somewhat. And it's true, there was a slight increase in interest rates for a little while, but that was rapidly turned around when there was a danger of a downturn in the economy again. So we are now facing a situation where the Fed is already super extended, and now they're going to go in several $1 trillion more, extending it even further. So we're definitely in new territory in terms of the ruling class's efforts to resolve its current financial crisis.
So maybe you could explain the difference between quantitative easing as it happened in 2008 and throughout with the different packages, and then the one that's occurring now.
Well, one of the forms of quantitative easing that's particularly distressing, I mean, there's the usual extending extending more money to the banks and so on, making loans very cheap to the banks. But one of the ones that's really scary to me, or scary is maybe not the right word, is that the Fed is now buying up bonds from all kinds of folks. Historically, the Fed buys government bonds as it attempts to stabilize the economy. And those are generally very, those are bonds that don't go under. But now it's buying all kinds of bonds from corporations, from municipalities, and some of these bonds that they're buying are junk bonds, which means that they are essentially taking trash into the Feds, into their balance sheet, and putting out money to replace the trash with. Now, this is a very dangerous operation, obviously, because the bonds that they then hold go bad, and that undercuts the balance sheet of the Fed. So it's kind of new territory. In addition, of course, they are also making a number of loan arrangements at very, very low interest rates. In fact, the president has even argued that we should consider negative interest rates where the banks have to, well, the banks issue loans, and if they don't issue the loans, they get penalized. So, it's like pushing really hard to get more money out into the economy to stabilize the economy.
Well, I guess what's like, why can't they just keep on doing that? Like, why can't they just keep on lowering federal interest rates?
Well, that's an interesting controversy about where things stand in the world. The first thing to remember is the U.S., coming out of World War II, essentially became the dominant imperialist and the key leader of the financial world. And as a result, the dollar became the foundation of the world's currencies. 80% of all trade and investment in the world is done in dollars. So there's always a huge demand for dollars, which keeps up their value by countries all over the world. And so, in a sense, the world as a whole is financing these extraordinary efforts by the U.S. government to stabilize the economy. Now, it's true that at some point, just like extending the debt of the government, from the Treasury issuing more bonds, they say that if your deficit gets too big and your debt gets too large, eventually it's unsustainable. And if something is unsustainable, it stops. But what does that mean? if you're dominating the world the way the U.S. imperialists are, then actually you are not suffering that much as an imperialist from these extraordinary efforts you're taking. In another country, for example, like Argentina, if they tried to do that, as they have in the past, they end up going bankrupt as a country because their currency is not the reserve currency in the world. It's not the basis for 80% of international trade and investment. Now, as long as the demand for dollars holds up, they can continue these extraordinary measures. But the long term, I mean, like suppose, like right now, the debt is approaching 100% of the GDP, right? In other words, the GDP is about $20 trillion a year in the US, and the debt is getting pretty close to that. And it may, before long, get beyond that. The maximum was 106 trillion, 106% of the GDP back in World War II. And it's likely that they're going to go into debt, which is more than 106% of the current GDP. But so this overextension eventually, say they went to 1,000%, then which would be really extraordinary. Then at some point, the countries are not willing any longer to use the dollar. Other imperialists begin to take over from the U.S. And then the U.S. becomes like every other country at some point if these extraordinary measures continue ad infinitum. And so there is ultimately a crunch that can happen to the U.S. economy as a result of its growing debt as a country and in the growing debt of the corporate sector.
So you have a situation, kind of summarizing a little bit of what you said, that you have a type of corona imperialism, right, in which the U.S. is able to, in a sense, finance its, you can't really call it a recovery, but finance its treading water, right? So it can kind of keep its head above the water and do things like quantitative easing because of the strength of the dollar and its ability to basically incur debts up to a theoretical point that we may or may not reach. And then you have, there's been a global pandemic. You have countries that aren't able to do that, as you mentioned, Argentina. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about kind of the debt situation in, I guess, what are normally called developing countries, and how they can't necessarily do the same things as the U.S. and why they're maybe suffering a bit more.
Well, sure. The many of the countries around the world are facing tremendous downward pressure on their currencies. So that what happens is that the value of their currency compared to the dollar becomes less, which means that anything they import into that country is going to be much more expensive in terms of the local currency. So anytime you have this kind of downward pressure on currencies around the world as a result of these crises, you're going to have much more poverty, unemployment, and distress, especially among the working class all around the world. So in a sense, these what's happening in the U.S. is only a fraction of what's happening to the working class of the rest of the world.
And on that note, so you have states in kind of the developing world trying to also tackle this problem through different means. Obviously, some not afforded to the U.S., but it's also kind of reshaping their economies. I wonder if you think that the current efforts, generally speaking, because obviously each country is facing this problem in its own way, could lead to a future austerity, kind of current spending leading to a future austerity.
Well, I think austerity is actually what a lot of the countries are facing already, like in Lebanon and many countries where they really run into some very severe economic crises that they can't really resolve. Then what happens is to get lending from some of the international institutions like the IMF, they have to do structural adjustment programs, which has happened for the last couple of decades and really created tremendous poverty in many countries throughout the world. And so the IMF, which is really largely a tool of the United States imperialists, is able to force these countries to get loans, but only on the basis of cutting back on basic subsistence needs of people. So it's another example of how in U.S. imperialism and imperialism in general as a system is totally destructive of the lives of the global working class, and how we definitely need to make revolution to overthrow this whole system and create something based on the interests of the working class, a communist system based on equality and collectivity. Until we do that, we're going to be facing these crises time and time again. We're going to be facing the increasing devastation of countries in the less developed areas, and the devastating racist impacts of these policies within the United States. So I think these crises are, while it's interesting to try to figure out exactly what the U.S. ruling class is trying to do, we know that whatever they're going to do, it's going to be harmful to the global working class.
Is there some complexities that come with these competing imperialist powers? Because, they're trying to, break down trade barriers while, keeping up barriers for their own interests. Like China, for instance, controls the flow of capital in and out. And obviously we have animosity towards China because of that. Mm-hmm. And same thing with Iran, do you see this headbutting between imperialist powers?
Yeah, I would say that really is the main characteristic of the world political economy right now. The U.S. is a relatively declining power compared to the rising strength of China. China's with its Belt and Road Initiative, its massive investments in Africa, its increasing investments in Latin America, and its efforts to control the areas around it, such as the South China Seas and in Hong Kong and even Taiwan. That it's really flexing its muscles in a way which comes from the fact that it's grown dramatically economically and now has an economic base that is getting close to rivaling the U.S. In purchasing parity. The Chinese economy is greater than the size of the U.S., although in nominal terms it's less. So in other words, it's grown a lot. Now it's got its own internal problems, obviously, but it's challenging the U.S. imperialists in many parts of the world. And there's other people, other countries whose capitalists and imperialists are also challenging the U.S. So that's, quite apart from the purely economic issues, those things can turn the economic issues on their head. You have a situation where China, for example, in the early part of this century, around 2002, was trying to elevate its currency to a rival to that of the United States. It wasn't able to do it at that time. It turned out that it really didn't have the internal structures that would enable it to have a rival current reserve currency. But still, it's got its eye on that, and that was 20 years ago almost. So it's certainly, they get the renminbi, the Chinese currency, could become a rival to that of the U.S. dollar. The euro is also another rival. So there's all kinds of economic questions that are tied into the political conflicts. And I think that we see these trade wars that are going on now can easily break into shooting wars. We almost have cases of that in South China Seas. So I think we're in a very delicate world balance right now. The U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. It's increasingly like there's many centers of imperial power in the world. And so the working class has to take account of this in terms of building a much more global movement, because all of these imperialists, all the leading forces in these societies are out to destroy the working class through exploitation. Remember, the whole function of capitalism is to extract surplus value or drag the profit out of the labor of workers. And they do that all over the world. Now, whether it's China, Vietnam, South Africa, Brazil, the US, they're all digging their profits out of the hide of the working class. And they're having trouble doing that in a lot of places. So I think that the efforts to rebuild a world communist movement based on this global working class is really critical. And there are a lot of possibilities. I mean, we've seen uprisings right now with George Floyd in the United States. Many workers and unions have supported this uprising in the U.S. We've seen all kinds of strikes going on around the world as people are resisting the kind of the austerity attacks that the ruling classes of the world are pushing on them. So I think it's a very volatile situation, and it's all the more reason for us to get out there and organize.
Well, an interesting question is, like, if somebody was to say that, this most recent crisis that's going on wasn't inevitable, would you how would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that a crisis was inevitable. I think the pandemic was, like I say, the proximal cause of it. It's sort of the trigger that led to the crisis coming out in full view. But the overwhelming debt crisis has been building for years. We never fully recovered from the 2008, as I said before. And as a result, we're deeper into a crisis mode than we were even then. And the idea that we're going to snap back and be back to where we were before is nonsense. I think that we have to remember that there's some underlying processes in capitalism that kind of underpin some of this. For example, the rate of profit is something that capitalists are very sensitive to, obviously, and they've had a lot of trouble maintaining their rate of profit over the last 40 years. And in fact, what they've done to try to shore up their profit is to extend credit, more and more credit, everything from credit cards to huge credits from banks, and then Fed then validates that and so on. So we're really talking about a challenge of falling rate of profits that the capitalists can't really overcome. As automation proceeds and as many of the other factors that lead to deterioration in profit rates proceed, we are still facing that underlying problem. And the debt crisis is really a reflection of that very basic Marxian analysis, that there's a tendency of the rate of profit to fall over time in capitalism. It doesn't always fall. Sometimes the capitalists are succeeding and pushing back, but that is a fundamental tendency. And I think we're seeing it expressed very strongly right now in the current crisis.
Going back to one thing you mentioned about kind of the stratified working class and the necessity to build a cohesive movement, a cohesive working class, a united working class, not only nationally but internationally. A lot of people tend to think of something like inequality as income inequality or wealth inequality, or in a certain sense, inequality kind of within the working class, and not necessarily an equality between classes. So my question is basically, how would you look at inequality, and how is this crisis going to affect this inequality, basically?
Well, I think there's no question but that the crisis has exacerbated both forms of inequality. That is, it's increased the stratification within the working class. There's a greater number of poor workers relative to the way there were before. But the biggest change in inequality is that between the capitalist class, what people like to call it the 1%. I think it's more like 1/10 of 1%. But anyway, between the capitalist class and the working class as a whole, the whole productivity gains that occurred in the 90s and in the 2000s, all of that went to the capitalist class. The division has gotten more and more obvious. And in the recent years, we found that the stimulus in the economy was to give more money to the capitalists through tax cuts, which were favored businesses. And it's funny, we get $1,200 to help us out through the crisis. Meanwhile, there are hundreds of billions of dollars being given to the corporate sector and the financial sector by the government. So that just exacerbates the inequality. And I think more and more people are beginning to see that whatever differences exist between workers, maybe more skilled workers versus less skilled workers, the big difference is between the working class as a whole and those parasites sitting at the top that are trying to rip us off every day and steal the value that we create.
The rent seekers. They're the rent seekers.
There's the rent seekers. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. They seek to reap where they never sowed. I know.
Yeah.
Would you classify this then as a more general crisis, kind of a general immiseration, instead of something more contained within a certain segment of the population? You could say maybe like the lowest of the lowest class or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen coming out of this. Right now, we have a very serious crisis with massive unemployment and many bankruptcies, and a desperate effort by the ruling class through its main institutions to try to salvage the situation. Maybe they'll succeed. I don't know. I kind of don't think that they're going to be back in the catbird seat anytime soon. I think that there's going to be a period of great instability, a general crisis for a period of a couple of years. And I think capitalists, they never die out on their own, unfortunately. They always have to be pushed out, overthrown by the working class. And so until that happens, they can make a recovery at some point, but it'll be a recovery. I don't want to say that this is the end of capitalism by any means, unfortunately. But this is definitely a severe crisis, and it may rival the Great Depression, I think.
Why do after a series of bankruptcies that collectively firms get more efficient? Because I would just assume that it has to do with they start eating each other, they start buying each other out, and just by becoming a monopoly they become more efficient or something like that.
Yeah, well, that's the nature of business cycles, and I think it's one of those situations where the companies that go out of business, their stuff is still there, right? I mean, it's not like they blew it up with dynamite or something. Their stuff is still there, and it's acquired by someone else. So there's winners and losers out of every depression, and the winners buy up the losers, 10 cents on the dollar usually. And then they have a much better physical plant to work from. Now, it's not always the most efficient, but in general, those companies that do take over will be able to once again extract surplus value from workers and regain profitability. That's what happens during the upswing of a business cycle. But it's not just an up and down sort of routine. It is like what you said, that companies become much more concentrated and centralized over time. Some argue, though, that sometimes they get too big for their own good, and that they sort of trip over each other's feet within the office suite. But I think that in general, the companies that survive a depression tend to be stronger at the beginning and end up doing better at the end. And by doing better, I mean they are more successful at exploiting the working class. That's their idea of success.
In a general sense, how exploitable do you think the working class can become given this crisis if there's no alternative?
Well, I think that what happens is when people are out of work and they have no benefit, they're talking about getting rid of the extra $600 for unemployment benefits at the end of July. So people become more and more desperate for work. And so the capitalists who have survived the crisis, which at this point is most of them actually, those capitalists then say, oh, well, good, I can hire this person at an even lower wage, and I can even stop them from having a union. I can break their unions, I can pay them less, and they'll be glad to come to work for me, because otherwise, because at the same time, the government is cutting back its social programs. In other words, it's cutting out food stamps, it's cutting out welfare. It did that in the 1990s, basically. And so the basic survival programs are already being hollowed out. So people have no choice but to go to work at a low wage. And we've seen this already in many parts of the economy where the wages are so low that people have to work at least 2 jobs and sometimes more in order just to survive. So, and of course, again, I don't want to forget the international situation. The workers in many other countries are almost not surviving off the wages that are paid by U.S. companies operating there or their own national capitalists working there. They all are trying to have a race to the bottom to see who can pay the least. Where can we find the most exploitable workers in the world, and then compete them against the ones who are less exploited until they're brought down too. So yeah, I don't think there's a real limit. The only limit is if we organize to fight back and build a revolutionary movement and fight back on the job and in the schools and the communities and so on, then we can set them back a little bit. But until we actually make revolution and destroy the whole capitalist system, they're going to keep pushing back on the working class day in and day out in order to maximize their profits.
Another thing I was wondering is, why can the stock market not reflect the well-being of a given industry or even the economy as a whole?
Well, the stock market is, I know that the President Trump really likes the stock market. He thinks that that's the economy, but he's wrong. The stock market has had this big boost ever since the 2008 recession because of the huge amount of money that's at very low interest rates has been poured out. If you're somebody who's trying to get a return on their investment, you're not going to buy a government bond at 1%. You're not going to buy into something that gives you virtually no return. You're going to go into the stock market. So as long as the interest rates are really low, you'll see a flood of money into the stock market because it provides a little bit better return. Now, in many ways, it's a casino. Gambling enterprise because it can crash as well. We saw it crashed a lot, and then it came back. It's one of those kinds of things that it's kind of fun to watch in one sense, but the reality is that the stock market only is one very, very limited way of understanding the economy, and it can have a huge bubble. I think right now we're looking at stock market prices that are once again approaching their highest level ever. Not quite there yet, but they're moving in that direction. And I think that does not reflect what they call the fundamentals in the economy, where major firms are going bankrupt and we're facing all these other forms of economic distress. So I would say that the stock market is hardly a representation of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, like, one thing I try to explain to people is how, most investors aren't necessarily paying attention to production. So when, a company starts maybe making more money because they laid off a bunch of workers, it's a temporary gain, or maybe they sued another company for a patent, people rush in to invest, and they're only focused on pulling out right before the company goes down. And so people aren't necessarily concerned about, like, how is that company doing in a holistic sense. And that's how bubbles happen, is they're not paying attention. In reality, they don't care about production. They care about getting that immediate return with regards to finance.
Sure. That's a good point. But I think we ought to think a little bit about what we can do better, because after all, I've said a few times that we need a revolution against capitalism, and I think a lot of our people who are listening to this are also on board with that. I mean, the anti-capitalist sentiment is very widespread around the country, but there's also a question: can we do better? Can we do better than the capitalist economy? So
I guess it would be important to kind of consider what a people's economy would look like. And would look like maybe under similar conditions, a pandemic, the necessity to kind of mobilize people to do one thing or another, and to, of course, keep people fed, housed, and generally in a state of well-being.
I think that's a good example of if you're not motivated by the profit motive, which is the whole be-all and end-all of capitalism, then you can organize the economy according to people's needs. And certainly in a pandemic, a communist society would mobilize its forces to make sure that everybody's needs are met, that we actually carry out the things that are needed to prevent the spread of the virus, like social distancing and masks and so on. And we would work very hard with each other to make sure we're all safe and taken care of. That's really not what capitalism does.
How would you respond to somebody who would say, well, what about all these other economic theories? We understand that neoliberalism is current. Why not a Keynesian model or something that was more nationalistic? Or, why, what are the difference between these, and why do they all fail along with neoliberalism?
Well, I think, Keynesianism came out of the Great Depression as an approach to try to pump up the economy and overcome the Great Depression and overcome other recessions. The first time you really had serious fiscal policy to expand the economy in that way was in the 1960s. So the Keynesian approach basically came to a crushing halt during the 1970s, during the period of stagflation, and then with a rise of Reagan and neoliberalism, they were saying, well, look, we need to get into a more competitive setting. We need to have more trade barriers fall. We need to reduce social spending, force people to be more competitive in their jobs and so on. And so that neoliberalism sort of took over from the Keynesianism, but the Keynesianism couldn't stop recessions either. So the point is that capitalism in both Keynesianism, neo-Keynesianism, all the various versions of that, and neoliberalism and so on, there's still the underlying basic premise that the society has to be motivated by individualism and profit seeking, and anything short of that is not going to work. And in fact, that's the very thing that doesn't work, because it creates the kind of anarchy of production that capitalism is famous for, and that leads to these crises. And so that's why I think when we talk to people about the need for communism, that we should be talking about the fact that there's no reason why we can't determine collectively what people need and how people's productive capacity should be used to meet the needs of the people in a given country and throughout the world. And I think that having a democratic centralist kind of organization leading society with input from below as well as leadership from the top would give rise to a sensible planned economy with a communist approach to meeting people's needs. Remember, an awful lot of production is artificial. An awful lot of people have jobs that are really superfluous. Take lawyers, for example, or take bankers. I mean, really, what value added do they really provide? We have lots of productive capacity to make what we need and then figure out new things to do. So I think that the idea of a planned economy using basic, new technologies that we have to make sure that we involve everybody in the decision making is the way to go. And then we have to talk to people about that. And of course, when you do talk to people about it, they say, well, that makes sense. Why don't we do it? And I say, well, let's do it. But then to do it, we need to stop capitalism. And that's going to take a revolution. That's going to take building a party and a revolution and a whole widespread understanding of the need for this new kind of society.
Do we need money? I guess that's a very important question, is like, does the economy need money?
Well, the capitalist economy certainly does need money in order to, because that's the way it measures its profit. But I think that money is not a necessity in a planned economy. Now, I think that a lot of folks have argued, well, but you still need a unit of account and that sort of thing. And it may well be that we need to have some way of measuring inputs and outputs for all of the productive possibilities and the kind of distribution system we want to use. But I think that money itself is not necessary. Once especially people have become clear about the need for real egalitarianism and collectivity in decision-making, once that happens, then it becomes moot. And there are cases in history as well as currently where there are societies where money is not needed and not used. There were gift economies back in the day, and there's all kinds of examples where we can actually function without having to have this intermediation of money.
Me and Luis, for instance, talk a lot about the Inca, but you also have like the Chinese communes are a very great example. And then, right now, people have been developing all these algorithms in the tech industries that allow us to distribute resources very efficiently.
Yeah, I think that's a real good point, that we now have the technology to do it easily and fairly. And I do want to make a point about the commune, because I think there's some very interesting lessons from the Great Leap Forward in the rural people's communes in China. They still maintain some money and some wage-related systems, but each commune, which embraced often hundreds of thousands of people, I mean, they weren't little small villages, they were multiple units of villages. one of the things that they did was they said, look, we're going to gradually reach the point where we don't need to have money or wages or anything like that. So we're going to start off with making 3 things free, with something like cloth, rice, and grain, right? And then in some communes, they got to 5 free things. In other communes, they got to 7 free things, and so on. So there was a process of moving in the midst of a challenging situation in China to a more thoroughly communistic way of doing things. And I think we learned from that we can actually steadily improve our situation after a revolution so that we can actually have a society without money, without wages, and meeting people's needs and overcoming the alienation of capitalism.
So you mentioned that example. It's an interesting example and definitely teaches us a lot. And what do you think a different system applying certain of those principles in a place like Langley Park or PG County? I know you work extensively there. How do you think that would look in a place like that that's been pretty severely affected by the coronavirus?
Yeah, well, I think that first of all, the community would be right now. There's efforts by CASA, for example, to deliver food to families that are affected. But this is a volunteer organization. I mean, they have limited capacity, and the same thing's going on all over the country. We have these mutual aid efforts where people are trying to take care of each other. There's a big one in Southeast Washington, and these are good examples of what we can do. But really, these are a drop in the bucket compared to what we can do if we have state power, if we have the power of the working class organized as the government of the society. Then we can make these things get resolved very easily. One of the problems in Langley Park is a lot of the people that live there have come from Guatemala and other Central American countries, and this is often the first stop that they make when they get to the United States. Some legal, some undocumented, and as a result, they're already somewhat in a problematic situation. That is, they may not have any real money or resources, and so they end up at 7-Eleven trying to get a job for $10 an hour if they're lucky, and so on. And they often get ripped off by these unscrupulous folks coming around to pick them up that have them work for a few days and then don't pay them. And it's that kind of situation. Well, that's the opposite of how communism works. That's the opposite of it. And so I think that right now we'll do what we can in terms of providing the necessities of life and helping out, getting them to get tested for coronavirus and so on. In fact, there's been a fair amount of success. In fact, Langley Park is one of the most heavily tested groups of people in Maryland. So that's a good thing because then we can detect where the virus is. But it's really not enough. And it's great that we're thinking in terms of how would we do it differently with a communist society.
That naturally speaks to kind of the limits and the insufficiency of the current system and even our best efforts within it. Right.
I think so, and that's why I've been involved with the Progressive Labor Party for many years, and I think that the ideas of building a revolutionary party really make a lot of sense, especially in the current moment between the uprisings against racism, the fight against economic deprivation. I think we really need to move forward and tell people about this alternative way of life that we can have, and but we have to fight hard for it. It's not going to be an easy struggle because those capitalists, those parasites up there, they have no interest in going to work ever. They're not going to become part of the working class. They're going to use whatever forces they can to stop us from seizing power. So, we have a lot of work to do to build that revolutionary working class that can change the world.
Okay, well,
struggle there to win. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good job, guys. This was pretty good.